For our Vandelay Forum app, we already have TestBox installed and configured because we did the ColdBox create app command earlier in this video series, and that pulled down not just ColdBox, but TestBox as well, because TestBox is part of the ColdBox template that we used from that command. If you'd like to use TestBox on an app that was not created this way, simply go to the directory where you have the app installed and run this command box command, install testbox --savedev. The install testbox part should be pretty self-explanatory. It installs testbox. The --savedev argument means testbox will be noted in your box.json file as a development dependency. So it knows this is a thing that developers will use while working on the app, but it's not a library that we need deployed to our production servers as part of the app's actual dependencies when it runs on the live website. This is a pretty common practice, not just in command box, but also other package-based systems like Node and NPM. If you've done any development with those kind of projects before, you'll be familiar with this idea of dependencies and dev dependencies as a separate thing. For TestBox, there are two folders in our project that we need to look at: TestBox and tests. TestBox is the actual machinery, all CFCs and such, that make up TestBox. The test folder is your test harness. This is where your actual tests for your application will live. With our Vandelay Forums app, we installed TestBox with the ColdBox create app command that we saw earlier, and that made both of these folders for us automatically, and it put all the appropriate stuff in each of them too to get us started writing tests. If you didn't build your app this way, you can still run the box install testbox command. That will create the test box folder for you, but you'll have to make the test folder manually for your test harness. Not a big deal. We'll look at what's in that folder now so you have an idea of what to expect. So here's your test harness folder. There are a few moving parts in here that are worth looking at. First, we've got our own application CFC file. This folder is its own app, separate from our Vandelay Forums app. But because this app is used for testing the Vandelay Forum app, we'll obviously need access to some of the functionality from Vandelay Forums. So you'll sometimes find bits of your main application CFC file from your app get copied into this application CFC file as well. Probably not everything, but you might need whatever logic determines, like which SQL database source you're using, maybe some mappings to where your included components live, things like that. That would all appear here in the test application CFC file. If you go to the runner.cfm file, this is where you actually run your tests from. Over here in the browser, you can see you just go to that URL, and there's all of the tests that I have that are running for us. You'll see tests in here for different handlers that you have added in your app already, messages, users, and anything else that was automatically generated, like the main handler that was created when we did the ColdBox create app, but we haven't actually used that handler for much of anything. That was all built for us from ColdBox create app. The other tests for our handlers were created when we did the ColdBox create handler command earlier in a different video. So anytime you make a section of your ColdBox app with command box, it's not only generating that section, it's also generating a starting point for you to write tests for that section of code as well. This is true for your handlers, for your service layers, for different things in your ColdBox machinery in your application. Let's take a look again at this runner.cfm file in code. Here's the runner CFM page. As you can see, it's a pretty small file that mostly consists of CF param tags. You use these tags to customize how you want TestBox to run, specify a different directory for where your tests might reside, if you want the report runner to output in HTML or JSON or PDF format, and so on. For our purposes, we're going to stick to the default settings and behavior. That's usually doing enough for most applications. You don't really need to change these too often in day-to-day development. The rest of what's in the test folder is mostly just the tests that you'd write. They're all formatted the same way as we discussed in the last video. You've got test bundles, suites, and specs. The CFCs all inherit from the base test components. You get the idea. You can organize your tests into as many subfolders under here as you'd like. In fact, I'd recommend it, especially if you have a large application. Larger apps mean more tests, so use subfolders underneath here to help organize those tests in a way that's similar to your application, enough that you can find the tests for various components or functionality in your app when you need to. Depending on which type of functionality you're testing, your test will inherit from one of several CFCs baked into TestBox. Their names are pretty self-explanatory. Base model test is for testing models, which are usually just chunks of business logic and SQL without a lot of MVC or ColdBox specific stuff inside them, except maybe some wirebox for injecting other CFCs and a few little things like that. Base handler test is used for isolating handlers for testing. So when we want to test the event handlers themselves, we'll write a test that extends base handler test. Base interceptor test, as you can probably guess, is for testing your interceptors. And finally, base test case is used for integration testing. Notice how the other three classes extend from base test case. So all the functionality in base test case is also available in the three previous classes that we just mentioned. So now we know how to build the tests. How do you actually run the tests? There are several ways you can do that depending on which workflow you prefer. First, you can open a web browser and go to tests runner.cfm. That will run the test harness code that we briefly looked at a minute ago. Here's the runner CFM file again. You can see it's mostly just different URL parameters you can pass into the URL if you want, or they're all configured here with defaults that work just fine. I'm not passing anything in, we're just using the straight runner.cfm URL, and you can see when I load that up, it runs all of the tests in our application. This is testbox for those of you that have not seen the output of that before. You can see I've got my different suites here of tests running. Tests that pass show up in green, tests that fail show up in the sort of yellow color, and you get a little bit more info about what in the test failed and that sort of thing in here. If there are errors, they show up in red, and so on. You get the idea. You can also run the test harness from the command line in CommandBox. First, you tell CommandBox where your test runner is located with this command we have here on the screen, package set testbox.runner equals, and then whatever the URL is that you typed into the browser in that last part right here. You can simply copy that URL and paste it right in here to your CommandBox command, run that, and then you can simply do testbox run. That will go out and actually run that same URL, as you can see here, and execute all of the tests the same way it did in our web browser. You can see I have 8 tests passing, 6 tests failing, and I get the red and green output based on which tests pass and which tests fail. So you have a little bit of color coding help here, even though you're not in a web browser getting the nice pretty HTML formatting that you have there. One thing you might be wondering is, why do I have some tests passing and some tests failing? That's actually by design. When you first create a test, like this messages test here that was created for us by the ColdBox create commands that we did earlier, when it first creates those tests and they're auto-generated for the system, here's the expectation that we have inside these tests. Expects false to be true, and we have another expects false to be true. That's by design, so obviously false is not equal to true in either situation or any situation. The reason you do that is you want your tests to fail first when they're not fully developed yet and have actual working code in them. That way you have a clear indicator on your screen which tests still need to be written out so that you're properly testing your application. If the default situation was an empty test would pass, you'd have no way of knowing by looking at screens like this which tests are passing because they're just stubbed out empty tests and which tests are passing because the code is truly passing your test. You'd have just a great big screen of all green output. It would all look correct. It'd be really easy to skip tests that haven't actually been developed yet, and you'd have just as many problems in your application as you would if you didn't have any tests at all. So by default, when you start a brand new test, make it fail first, and then go back and write code that makes the test pass after that point, so you actually have good test coverage in your code. You can also use the testbox watcher command. So rather than having to retype testbox run every time you want to run the tests, the testbox watcher will literally watch your tests and application code for changes to them. And whenever a new change is saved, the tests will all automatically run again. So you have no risk of forgetting to run your tests and checking in broken code that would affect your other teammates. You can simply go here to your command line and type testbox watch. See how it says watching files, and we're not actually back at a command prompt yet. I'm going to go in here to my code and I'll edit something like, let's say we go into the handler, maybe messages, and I'll make a change in my handler here. Maybe this list function, that sounds good. I'll turn that interceptor service line of code back on. Hit save. Now I'm going to go back to our console output, and you can see I didn't actually type testbox run anywhere. The testbox watcher automatically executed the tests again for me as soon as it saw that new file got saved with an update for it. If I go back here and change my code again, I'll comment the line of code out and save it and go back. It's going to actually run the tests a second time. It's kind of hard to see here because the screen gets cleared every time that it runs, but if I scroll up, you can see there is the second set of tests. There's the one it ran the first time that I added that service call, and here's code the second time when I commented it out. All the documentation for Testbox is available at testbox.ortusbooks.com. Ortus Solutions also offers training workshops that focus solely on using Testbox to its full advantage. Contact Ortus Solutions for more information about those classes.